I am pleased to welcome you to this side event on managing water challenges in a developing economy, a DFI approach, on behalf of the Development Bank of Southern Africa, all protocols observed. My name is Danny Gaillard-Pichet. I am Global Coordinator for Water and Climate Processes at the Global Water Partnership, and I'm very honored to be asked to facilitate this very interesting discussion today. So that you know, GWP is a multi-stakeholder action network which is active in 13 regions and 65 countries, and we work very close in South Africa with our partners there to increase climate financing opportunities. So very apropos that we are part of this discussion here today. This side event is going to discuss innovative solutions in a near water scarce South Africa. The country is ranked as one of the driest in the world, a situation exacerbated by undefined conservation efforts, insufficient water infrastructure maintenance and investment, frequent droughts driven by climatic variation, and unequal access to safe and reliable water and sanitation. This valuable resource continues to be lost. To illustrate possible approaches that DFIs and partners can undertake to prevent catastrophic water problems, the panelists are going to discuss a number of things today. The root cause of the shortage of this resource, starting from climate change variations, a lack of understanding of the crucial role played by ecological infrastructure and conservation, water security planning, and delivery of the resource to communities. It's also going to evoke innovative programmatic approaches to improve water conservation, quality, and water use efficiency, ensuring sustainable, equitable supply that includes youth and vulnerable communities. We're also going to look at the role of the public and private sector partners in crowding in funding for water projects, and tangible solutions for different stakeholders, such as municipalities and other stakeholders in the water sector. The discussion is going to be divided into 3 parts today. So the first part, we will seek to identify the root cause. What are the underlying drivers and practices that have led to water shortages, near catastrophic circumstances, and an inability to deliver this commodity to communities, including the poor? The second part is going to explore possible innovative solutions to address challenges associated with developing bankable pipelines. And in part 3, we're going to present a case study of the DBSA's approach towards solving these challenges associated with financing water projects. So with me today to discuss these issues are Lebourang Mulesi, Commissioner for the Presidential Climate Commission of South Africa, who's here at my left. Olympus Mantata, Head of Climate and Environment Finance of the DBSA, to my right. He'll be intervening a little bit later in the conversation. And then we have some people online with us today, so we're going to check and make sure that they're still there. Yes. Is Ruth Bookman present? Yes. Hello. Good morning, Ruth. Ruth is our freshwater and policy lead at WWF South Africa, and she's joined by her colleague Carolyn Gelderblom, manager for water source partnerships at the WWF South Africa. Good morning to both of you. Hopefully, we'll be able to hear you a little bit later.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning, everyone.
We have 3 others that have joined us virtually as well. Nicola Mander, Director of Climate and Energy from Crown Agents. Good morning, Nicola. And
morning,
Constant Brunette, Senior Deal Originator from DBSA.
Good morning, everybody.
Good morning. And finally, last but not least, we have Alex McNamara, the Program Manager for Water and Environment National Business Initiative in South Africa. Good morning to you.
Hi, good morning.
Yes, we have a full house. Good. Well, thank you, first of all, for all being with us today. There are a lot of speakers, so I would ask you to please kindly stick closely to the allotted time. And I'm going to have to be a strict timekeeper, so I apologize in advance for that. Let's dive directly into part 1, where each speaker is going to have 5 minutes to speak to the drivers and practices that lead to water shortages and the inability to conserve and provide the services. We're going to turn to Ruth, first of all. Ruth, if I can ask you a question, do we value our ecological systems and infrastructure enough?
Thank you so much. I hope everyone can hear me, and thank you to the DBSA for inviting us to be part of this. We're very honored. Danny, to answer your question, no, sincerely, I don't believe that we do value our ecological infrastructure adequately. I'm going to ask, I do have 3 slides to take me through the key points that I would like to make in response to your question. Danny, if we can just arrange that. And I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to see it. You can see it, and I'm going to have to remember because it's not showing on my screen. So let's just go for this. I think we realize that we are speaking to an international audience, and I think it's important to highlight that we're going to be sharing experience from South Africa, and in particular in some of the work that WWF South Africa has been doing. But to set the context, I think it's critically important that we highlight all the challenges that we face in South Africa in the water sector. And you asking me a question about ecological infrastructure, and it will follow in my following slides. But let's look at the bigger picture first. And we are looking very much at a challenging situation in South Africa in terms of water infrastructure. I hope everyone can see the screen quite clearly. But just in terms of our history, in terms of the access to water and sanitation, in terms of the state of our infrastructure in the country for water treatment and wastewater treatment works, in terms of the loss of revenue through non-revenue water, we're looking at billions. We need billions over the next few years, 10 years, huge amounts of resources. And also in South Africa, we still have to deal with the inequities that we've inherited. And if we look at allocation of water, we have, it's very inequitable. And of course, we're going to focus and zoom into the ecological infrastructure, and you'll see the wetlands logo there. And our wetlands are we've lost 50% of our wetlands, and the remaining 33% is in a very poor condition. And as you will see from what I'm going to say, the wetlands and other ecological infrastructure is most important. We are using the term ecological infrastructure really because we want to demonstrate the fact that ecology offers services. And this is what infrastructure does. There's services, they're built services, built infrastructure, and natural infrastructure. Sorry. Also want to highlight that South Africa's water is allocated, 98% allocated. May I have the next slide, please? Thank you. So given these water challenges in South Africa, given that climate change is already impacting in the country, we are looking at worsening conditions of water scarcity. We're looking at increased variability. We're looking at increased intensity. We need to, and this is our very strong message to everyone participating today, is that we need to focus on the strategic water source areas in the country. Now, these are areas, basically, it's a minute percentage of land in South Africa, only 8%, but 50% of our surface water. There are also groundwater strategic water source areas, but I'm not going to talk about them today. But these areas produce our water. So in times, in the times that we're at with huge water challenges, both on the natural side, on the infrastructural side, on the institutional side, in all these aspects, we are facing water constraints. Surely our priority is to emphasize the importance of these water factories, the strategic water source areas. And just to give you an indication of how important they are, 50% of our population is supported by these strategic water source areas. There are 22 of them color-coded there on the map. 64% of our economy depends on these areas, and 70% of our irrigated agriculture. So of tremendous importance. Now, I think we have acknowledged the importance in our policy instruments in the country, but they are existing in policy instruments. And I think where the big challenge is in terms of recognizing the importance of the ecological infrastructure in the strategic water source areas because of the vital role that they play to South Africa's water security, it's now we have to move from just recognizing the policy instrument that they're in the policy instruments and moving to action and to really figuring out how we secure these water source areas. I have one more slide just to make my point before you get strict with me, Danny. And yes, this is the one, thank you. We are referring to the ecological infrastructure, nature's services that it provides. And it's so critically important, but undervalued, to answer your question, not fully appreciated by all that need to appreciate the importance of ecological infrastructure. If I can just draw your attention to the diagram below, just to say that we somehow prioritize and acknowledge, we do acknowledge the importance of built infrastructure. We need the built infrastructure in South Africa, in the SADC region, on the African continent. We need built infrastructure. But that built infrastructure, point number one, is dependent on the natural infrastructure, on that ecological infrastructure. And if you have a degraded highland catchment area, you're going to have a shortened lifespan of your built infrastructure. The other thing is that with climate change impacts and intensity and of events, extreme events, and with droughts and floods, your natural infrastructure, your ecological infrastructure is actually going to help regulate some of those disasters. I'm not going to go through, in the interest of time, all the climate change impacts. The information is there, but I do want to say that, it's floods and droughts and increasing water scarcity. There's increasing fires. There's increasing intensity of the fires. And in South Africa, we have a huge problem in these areas of, first of all, grasslands that are not managed. So that ecological infrastructure is not managed well enough. And also we have a tremendous problem of invasive alien plants. And please look at the text that is highlighted in blue there, just to indicate what kind of an impact these invasive alien plants have. So it's in most of those water source areas, you have this infestation of alien plants. They are very thirsty. And if you manage these alien plants and you clear them and you maintain those landscapes, you are going to free up a lot of water for the country. So we've put a tremendous amount of emphasis on alien invasive clearing. It's not the only aspect, and I will talk about that a little bit later if you give me the chance there, Danny, just to say about how to address some of these challenges. Yes. But thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you so much, Ruth, for setting the scene of this conversation. I think it's very important to recall the basic premises, the availability of the resource and the natural resource, and I really liked what you said about, the built infrastructure and the natural infrastructure have to work together to provide our needs. I'm going to turn now to Nicola Mander from Crown Agents. And I was hoping that you could speak to us a little bit about how water shortages could be averted through stakeholder involvement and partnerships.
Thanks, Danny. Hopefully you can hear me okay.
Yes.
Great. Okay, so South Africa has established a system of very large wall-to-wall water management areas within which the strategic water source areas that Ruth was talking about fall. These water management areas are obviously spatially defined by watershed boundaries and not by administrative boundaries. So they tend to include several municipal or local government areas, and often they cut across the administrative boundaries of provincial or regional governments in South Africa. Now, because these areas are so large, they also contain a diversity of land uses and water use activities. And consequently, they also contain many diverse groups of stakeholders with different and often competing interests around water resources. Now, in terms of our institutional architecture for water resource management in South Africa, these water management areas are governed by catchment management authorities, or CMAs. Now, CMAs are legal entities whose primary purpose is to regulate water use in the catchments that they manage. And under the National Water Act, they are the mandated facilitators of participatory water resource management at a landscape scale. CMAs must set up catchment management forums, and these are really meant to be the forums by which one facilitates stakeholder participation in water governance at a countrywide level. The reality, though, is that this institutional architecture struggles somewhat to achieve effective participatory water governance at scale. There are certainly pockets of excellence, but I think looking at it at a country level, we haven't got the level of participation in water resource management that would be desirable. And there's many reasons why this may be so. Some people argue that CMAs are underfunded. Other people say that they're ineffectively administered. And others suggest that they are just simply hindered by politics, which is not surprising given how important water is as a power play instrument. Our own experience of working with stakeholders around water security improvement, and particularly taking a recent example of having worked with stakeholders in the Keerboom's River catchment in the Southern Cape part of South Africa, has highlighted for us that CMAs have a primary responsibility to manage water and not, in fact, the watersheds or the catchments that are effectively the systems that produce the water. So that means that despite their name, catchment management agencies, they don't actually manage catchments at all. This means that they really only have the power to manage a very small part of the systems that generate the water that they regulate the use of. And this means that they're not really in such a good position to build the kinds of partnerships that are needed to facilitate effective management of water resources at scale in South Africa. And I think as a concept, it's quite useful to think about water as the product of a functional social ecological system. Now, what do I mean by a social ecological system? Essentially, this is a concept that recognizes the mutually reinforcing or degrading, as the case might be, relationships and feedback loops that exist in society's use of water and the ecological infrastructure that actually delivers it. We effectively cannot manage water resources without also managing our human and economic relationship with the ecosystems that deliver the water. So given that we know that water security is dependent on good management of these social ecological systems, it's obvious that strong partnerships and good stakeholder understanding of their influence on water resources are both fundamentally necessary if we're going to manage water effectively in the country. And this is particularly in a context of increasing water stress with population growth, economic growth, and also with climate change, as Ruth was saying. So water is our ultimate shared resource. The impacts of one party in a watershed has a cascade effect on multiple parties in other parts of the system, directly affecting their ability to access water. So we need to work together at a system scale if we're going to manage water effectively. Because our current water governance institutional framework is struggling to create these partnerships and to build this level of participation that we need, what we are starting to see is a number of stakeholder-driven collaborative efforts to manage water resources together and to manage these at a system scale. It's quite interesting that the day zero water crisis in 2017, where the city of Cape Town nearly ran out of water, has led to a really substantial focus on how one can be managing the water supply catchments as a long-term water security strategy for Cape Town. Similarly, the eThekwini municipality that manages the city of Durban had the same thought back in 2010 when they recognized that if they didn't begin to proactively begin to address management of their major water supply catchment, which is the Umgeni catchment, they were going to also be running out of water in a few years' time, and also suffering from escalating costs relating to treatment of water as water quality declined in the system. So essentially, we see that our current architecture under the National Water Act of trying to build collaborative water resource management is somewhat struggling for a number of different reasons. But we are beginning to see how stakeholders themselves are mobilizing from the ground up, really, to begin to create, which I think is very heartening. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Nicola. I think it was a very interesting experience that you shared. Stakeholder processes are difficult. They're messy, but they're so necessary to create the buy-in that we need for projects to work. Now we're going to turn to Constant Brunette from the DBSA to talk about the barrier of financing, because obviously if you don't have financing, if you don't have funding, not a lot can get done. So over to you, Constant.
Yeah, no, thank you, Danielle, and it's a pleasure to be with you today, and thank you for the opportunity. So I think I'm just going to touch a little bit on some of the bottlenecks that we have experienced as a DFI to crowd in the repayable finance into the sector. I think traditionally the water sector in South Africa was mainly financed through municipal internal sources, which include tariffs, taxes, and grants flowing from the national fiscus. And these sources are traditionally preferred by municipalities as they do not require any form of repayment. But obviously, I think it's clear that they will be insufficient to close the financing gap, as was outlined earlier, and that we would need to look at crowding in alternative sources, and particularly repayable finance, if we were to advance the SDG 6 agenda. So a potential solution for municipalities is to raise repayable finance in the market. And as we know, repayable finance into the sector has been slow. And from our perspective, some of the challenges or bottlenecks experienced that restrict the potential flow of funds are, first of all, not having an enabling environment and a lack of political will. And when I refer to enabling environment, I refer to commitment from municipal leadership as well as the council, having efficient and effective decision-making and resolution-taking processes, getting these projects into the updated infrastructure development plan and into the budgets. So political will is a big one. There's often a lack of institutional capacity, especially at smaller municipalities, to prepare projects up to bankability and to access potential funding in the market. So what we also experience is projects are not optimally formulated in order to maximize benefits. Often a one-dimensional approach is followed by municipalities when packaging and preparing projects, limiting the scope and scale of projects. And this often impacts on the viability and sustainability of projects. Often project preparation processes does not take into consideration the different risk and credit evaluation criteria required by financiers. So what is required during the prep process is a more holistic and inclusive approach towards infrastructure and service delivery, focusing on institutional, technical, financial, legal, environmental risk. So looking at a holistic approach towards project preparation and service delivery. Another challenge that we come across is that a few programs are designed to eliminate the issue of operation and maintenance, or address the issue rather of operation and maintenance. That's something that really leads to the challenges in the first place. And then that brings me to the issue of water pricing. More often than not, water, or the price of water, does not reflect its true economic cost of value. And the value water is as a scarce resource in South Africa. And adequate billing and cost recovery is an integral part of service provision. And this risk needs to be assessed and mitigated during the project preparation process. Another aspect that's often overlooked is real option analysis. For instance, financing and implementing a large-scale non-revenue water program in a municipality will defer significant capital investment required for augmentation and bulk distribution schemes, for instance. And then last hurdle that we've also identified is often financiers use different risk criteria when evaluating potential projects, and this results in projects not yielding the expected or adequate risk-adjusted returns for these financiers. And maybe just closing on my side, I would like to believe that there are, I would say, 4 overarching pillars that need to be addressed to improve the flow of repayable finance into the sector and the rollout of infrastructure at scale. So first of all, improving the enabling and investment environment, that's a key one. Secondly, improving the project preparation process and de-risking of a project, taking a holistic and inclusive approach towards infrastructure and service delivery, and moving away from piecemeal development. Then improving and promoting greater standardization of various types of projects, whether it's a non-revenue water project or a water reuse project. Standardization holds a number of benefits, including reduced transaction costs, improved speed to the market, etc. And I will touch on that a bit later on. And then also applying blended financing principles in order to leverage and crowd in more commercial funding and implement fit for purpose and affordable infrastructure.
Great, thank you so much for that. There are a host of challenges that you've identified, but you've already started to transition into the second part of the conversation around the possible solutions. So thank you very much for that. We are going to have a conversation in person now, and I'm going to turn to Le Bohang, and if I could ask you, what is the impact of poverty and the limited employment opportunities for youth? How does that cycle into these challenges that we're facing?
Thank you very much, and thank you for focusing on the youth and the challenges that they would have when it comes to accessing of water. So we know the problems that plague the South African economy, being the most unequal country in the world, and these inequalities are reflected in the way that water is being distributed in South Africa. So what you'll find is that there'll be these great inequities in between the distribution between rural and urban areas. So what you'll find is there are still communities, rural communities, where access to water is a serious challenge in South Africa. But even within urban and peri-urban areas, there is a significant challenge in accessing water, and there is huge inequalities within urban and peri-urban regions as well. So what you'll find is in your more well-off municipalities, where there are a number of people who are working in those municipalities, and there are a number of revenue collection that goes and flows in the direction of those municipalities, water infrastructure is perfectly maintained. When you go into areas where there are a lot of indigent communities, where a lot of the youth are because of the high unemployment challenge in South Africa, particularly facing the youth of South Africa, what you'll find is that water infrastructure is not very well maintained. And that means that quite honestly, we deprive those communities of water. And this is around the fact that, municipalities cannot generate sufficient revenues because there are so many indigent members and indigent households in a particular municipality. So they can't raise the revenue in order to pay for water services, to pay for water service infrastructure. So what purely happens is that when water infrastructure in those regions is broken or is not well maintained or cannot be used, it's usually left that way. leaving those communities in a particular predicament. We also need to talk about this issue of water tankers and supply of water to indigent communities and the manner in which it's being managed at a municipal level. It's completely irregular, highly corrupt. So what then happens is that water tankers are sent into regions for prolonged periods of time instead of fixing the water infrastructure in those regions because of the tenderization of water provision in those regions. So instead of fixing the water infrastructure, what you'll have is that a particular water tanker goes in there and the municipality generally won't fix it because it is in someone's best interest to keep water tanks in those regions, which is a huge challenge. I mean, if we deprive people of the basics, water as a basic for survival, and we do this on the basis that we cannot collect revenue from indigent communities where we know a lot of youth are members of those households, I think that's an indictment on basic human rights. So, I mean, the way in which we also don't even address enough the issue of, you know, inequality in the distribution of water. To be quite honest, the middle income households in our society are quite wasteful in the way that they make use of water. There's water leaks, there's a general wastage in the way that water is being used. If you can pay for it, there's a general perception that, you know, you can make use of it however you want to make use of it. And this is perpetuating the divide in between, you know, households that can access water easily and those that cannot. Another thing that we have to talk about and we have to really look at quite honestly, yes, the issues of water provision and water resource, climate change has a significant impact on those, and yes, we understand that. But another thing that we don't talk about quite seriously is the way in which industries make use of water. Industries make use of water quite wastefully, and they use a significant amount of fresh, clean water that communities with indigent households could be benefiting from. But industries are literally wasting a lot of fresh, clean water on a daily basis. On top of that, the waste from industries that goes into fresh, clean water is a serious problem that needs to be addressed. Yes, there's an issue of climate change, but there are things that we are doing in the way in which we conduct our industry, the way in which we conduct our consumption that are a serious problem that must be addressed. I think Day Zero, in a way, challenged the way that we make use of water resources every day. We need to be conscious of those issues moving forward because at the end of the day, we have enough resources to go around. The problem is the inequitable distribution that becomes a serious problem, especially for households that cannot, you know, pay revenue and services to the municipality that need to seriously be taken into consideration.
Thank you for speaking out on those issues. You know, water is a basic human right. Thank you for reminding us of that. And I think South Africa has been very progressive in that they've inscribed that right into the Constitution. So there are examples of how that can be done to a better extent. For example, you were talking about industrial use. You know, there are ways that recycling and reuse of water can be integrated into those systems to make sure that there's more resources available for the populations who still need them. So we've done a survey of all of the challenges that exist out there. What we're going to turn now to is to the possible solutions. So I'm always someone who wants to fix things. So you give me a problem and I want to fix it, right? So I think I'm going to lead our conversation in that direction now. And right now, first of all, we're going to speak with Caroline Gelderblom, who's online. We heard a lot about enabling environments previously. And could you maybe share with us what you think about how you can create an enabling environment for good policies to emerge?
Thanks so much. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak on this platform. And I have got some slides to keep myself focused so that I keep on time. And I think the encouraging thing is that our government has recognized the national importance of these strategic water source areas, both in our water policies, but also in other policies, such as the infrastructure policies. And that's really encouraging to see that. There's no specific legislation which recognizes those strategic water source areas highlighted by Ruth, but we can use aspects of our National Environmental Management Act to protect them. And government is currently prioritizing the identification of additional mechanisms that we can use to secure these areas. So this is definitely something which is very high up on the government's agenda to create a supportive policy environment. And we need to make sure that we have the finance to support the long-term maintenance of our catchments. And it's important to recognize that rehabilitation is not a once-off cost. That was the slide that I showed up there. The initial costs are highest, but like our built infrastructure, our catchments need active maintenance. And we are working with partners to WWF, to the Landscape Finance Coalition, and also with the Green Outcomes Fund, where we work with the private sector to develop innovative financing solutions. But as highlighted by Constant, the sustainability of these solutions is dependent on increased revenue from water tariffs. And if I could have my next slide, where we can just have a little bit more look at that. So currently we have perverse blanket subsidies, which are currently supporting unsustainable water use, which was highlighted by the previous speaker, Lebekang. And these subsidies need to be gradually removed to make the true value of water apparent and to encourage better water stewardship. And I'm glad to say that there are ongoing studies and processes and key stakeholder engagement in this regard, but it's not easy in a society highlighted by Lebekang. It's still very unequal, and we must therefore manage it very sensitively. And we therefore need transition finance to support a movement to more sustainable technologies. And this is critical across the board, but it's particularly true in agriculture, which is our most intensive water user, and we'll need private sector support for this. And in parallel with this, we need to attain targeted subsidies for those such as resource-poor farmers who really need them. And tariffs for agriculture need to be phased in gradually. And we recommend a proportional increase rather than a flat rate increase. And if you're wanting to know what kind of increase we are needing, it's actually relatively small. Our initial calculations for two catchments in the north of the country and the south of the country indicate that it's well under 5% increase in tariffs, which if allocated to catchment management, would be sufficient to maintain that ecological infrastructure which Ruth highlighted as being so essential in terms of providing the water in our dams. If I could have my next slide, please. So in engagement with key stakeholders, we've identified a significantly increased willingness to explore the use of conventional finance, and you're hearing that from Constant as well today, which in the past was previously used just for built infrastructure, but also to support the maintenance of ecological infrastructure. The question is, how exactly do we structure that? And we need to create a precedent of how water finance can and should be used for water financing, for catchment management. So if you build a dam, you need to budget for the maintenance of the catchment above that dam, because if you don't, you could use up to 50% of the capacity of that dam very quickly. And that really would be negligent in terms of investment, because you're putting your investment at risk. So it just makes good financial sense as well. And the next step after creating a precedent, and I think there is appetite for that, is to make this kind of conditional finance a standard practice, because we don't want it to be exceptional in the future. And ultimately, we'd want the state of the catchments to reflect on local authorities' balance sheets as natural capital to enable them to raise finance for its maintenance. We want to hold these local authorities to account. And we're starting on that journey, but there's a lot of work that still needs to be done. If I could have the next slide, please. I think, Ruth has highlighted the scope of the problem, and Constant has highlighted, the fact that there's not limitless finance. And we're not going to be able to raise enough funds at this stage to do everything we need to do. The need is too great. And so the most important thing we need to do now is to identify priority areas for investment and then to develop partnerships, as highlighted by Nikki, to help align existing and new funds and to develop the capacity to spend it effectively. And that capacity to spend it effectively is critically important. And I think my colleague Ruth will speak again about that later. And as part of this process, it's important to recognize the co-benefits of catchment restoration. The way that we restore catchments creates a lot of low-income jobs, which are really good in terms of stimulating the local economy, and they can also be done in a COVID-safe way, which is obviously important. And they also help secure our tremendously diverse biodiversity. And this will help secure significant additional funding. But all of this finance needs to be aligned behind agreed co-developed catchment management strategies. And for example, if we get that alignment, the private sector can help smooth out the investment, which from the public sector currently has a stop-start approach, which results in a tragic loss of traction and jobs, huge social and ecological costs. So by blending the finance from different sources, we can get a much better outcome. So just my final slide is then just to highlight those 3 points again. The fundamental principles is that we suggest that the long-term foundation is that our water tariffs have to be increased to reflect the true value of water while still protecting the vulnerable. That's the only way to encourage sustainable water use and to finance these innovative solutions. And then we also need to ensure that the substantial budgets which are set aside for water infrastructure also include the maintenance and restoration of the ecological infrastructure on which they depend. We've got a tagline in WWF South Africa: water doesn't come from a tap. The water in the dam doesn't come from anywhere. It only will come from healthy catchments. So we have to maintain those catchments and recognize that dependency. And finally, I think that the most important is to align or blend the new funds and existing funds around agreed priorities. And we can only do that through partnerships. And I think that Nikki's highlighted the importance of that. So yeah, I think that that's the enabling environment from my perspective. It's twofold. It's recognizing how important they are. It's securing that financing, and also just recognizing that there are a lot of resources. The key thing is that we work together in partnerships and at a local level. And I'm not going to say more now because I know Ruth will speak further on that.
Great, thanks for that. We are actually going to jump directly to Nikki because I'm sure he has a lot to say about these financing aspects. How do the ideal institutional arrangements and planning capacities? How can you ensure that happen, Nicola?
That's quite a question, and I'm not sure that I can answer it with the sort of the rule book off the shelf that says here's the ideal model. I mean, different contexts might have slightly different responses, but what I am going to do is share, excuse me, one really interesting example of an institutional model which is emerging in Durban in response to the need to build partnerships around water resources management, and that is the Umgeni Ecological Infrastructure Partnership Program. And essentially, this was an initiative that was driven by the eThekwini municipality, as I mentioned before, in recognition of their future water concerns, both from a water availability perspective, but also a water quality perspective. Now, the Umgeni catchment is a huge catchment in the KwaZulu-Natal province. It supplies Durban with most of its water, but also several other economic zones in the province. So it's a really important catchment, but it's also a catchment that faces a lot of challenges around agricultural water use, a lot of rapid urbanization, a lot of industrial pollution in the catchment. So this partnership has been a really interesting model showing how one can convene different actors around the table and around a common vision and common set of management objectives for a catchment that is under huge pressure. So this partnership currently involves 24 government departments, a whole lot of academic institutions who are interested in the research angle, private businesses, both polluters and those who are dependent on the quality of the river for their own business interests, and non-profits have basically partnered around this partnership. They've signed a memorandum of understanding, which essentially documents their commitment to the partnership and to their investment in restoring, maintaining, and managing ecological infrastructure in the catchment for improved water outcomes. Effectively, their activities have included joint fundraising, research, collaborative water resource and land use planning, training, and most importantly also action on the ground to restore critical wetlands and riparian areas that have been degraded, and also to address key pollution sources. What has been quite an interesting lesson coming out of this actual process of getting a partnership on the ground in a watershed has been the recognition finally that choosing grey or green infrastructure around water resources is not a binary choice. You can actually choose both, and they are mutually reinforcing. So managing your grey infrastructure for water resources and managing your green infrastructure for water resources can actually work together quite well. And I think we were hearing that just now around how managing your catchments is so important to protect the integrity of your dams. And the same goes for all of your hard water infrastructure like pipelines. You know, making sure that you've got good quality water going into your pipelines means that those pipelines will last longer. So thinking about it at a system scale and managing at a system scale, both the green and the grey, has proven to be a really useful sort of process in the Umgeni. The other thing that they've learned through this process, and just reinforcing my previous point about the social ecological system, is that to be sustainable, investments in ecological infrastructure for water resource outcomes must also include investments in developing human capacity, strengthening institutions and governance, and influencing social behavior. The program has found that there is much to be gained from investing in social learning. Again, there is no recipe book that one can pull off the shelf to follow the rules and tick the boxes on how to deal with water resources challenges in every single context all over the world. One almost needs to take a learning by doing approach to say, look, here is our context. There's a particular political economy. There's a particular sort of natural biophysical state. There's particular pressures in operation. How do we work together to resolve these challenges? And how do we learn by trying different approaches? And I think that's been one of the strengths of the Umgeni Ecological Infrastructure Partnership, is it's been very strongly focused on learning together and building knowledge together. And that process has actually been really powerful in bringing stakeholders to the table who otherwise may not have been keen to partner in such an initiative. So the initiative has seen a lot of success in building state-citizen relationships, which otherwise may not have been the case, just by making it an open process that is about learning and shared learning. There was a really interesting sort of project that fell almost under the Umgeni Ecological Infrastructure Partnership, and that was a project that took place in the Alla River, which is one of the Umgeni tributaries in the Durban area, where a local conservancy worked with local communities in a program that they called Eco-Champs, which was essentially about employing people in a local community where rivers were particularly degraded, where the community was degrading them further by how they were treating the rivers, and having those eco-champs in the community become social change agents, really working with the community to build their understanding of why the river was important for them and what they could actually do to help manage it and take care of it. And what has emerged out of that process is a really interesting model of how you build community stewardship of rivers and water resources from the ground up. So we've got the Umgeni Ecological Infrastructure Partnership Program, which kind of is almost top down in the sense that it was initiated by government and has sort of crowded in partnerships and involvement over time. And then we've got this other project, which is an example of doing it the other way around, building partnerships from the ground up. So, I mean, it's not an institutional model that, you know, one can hold up and say we need to do this everywhere and it's going to solve everyone's problems. But I think it's a really interesting example of how one can actually begin to approach the challenge of water resources management.
Yes, yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you for sharing those examples. They're very rich. And again, the need to hear voices and to share learning with each other to increase that awareness that we have a shared responsibility for the management of water. Now, I'm going to turn to Ruth again. You already spoke a little bit about how built infrastructure cannot actually function properly without maintenance of the ecological infrastructure. But if you wanted to add, how do we do that in the best possible way?
Fantastic. I'm so excited by what Nikki just said. Because it just resonated with what we wanted to share. So thank you, Nikki, for talking about EIP, a significant partnership in that landscape. We have a few more slides, only 3 more slides from me. So if we could project the second half of my set that I sent through, please, Danny.
Yeah, we're just pulling those up. You want the next one, correct? You want this one?
Yeah, no.
No, the
one before, please.
Okay, got it.
Thank you. That's great. So Nikki, you'll see a lot of similar things there on the slide. I think if what Nikki was saying was really about these innovative partnerships, landscape partnerships, and it's something that we've prioritized in terms of how do we actually mobilize the right partners, the funders, the NGOs, the community-based organizations, the parastatals, the government departments, trying to work together in a cohesive way and in a multi-stakeholder partnership to really get a sense of how to get things moving and to leverage resources for action on the ground. And that's what the beauty of these partnerships are. So very much and also just to say that I'm pleased to say also I know that SANBI and others are also involved in the UEIP initiative, and we work with SANBI as well to try and support the Department of Forestry, Fisheries and Environment in trying to unpack what does it mean actually to secure these strategic water source areas. So we're working together to try and put together a toolbox or a suite of mechanisms that's going to help us secure these water source areas. So some of the key aspects of that is leveraging the right stakeholders, bringing them together and forming these community, public, private partnerships, the CPPs. And to do that, you need resources. And we partner with the private sector has been incredibly supportive here. And this is seen on the map that you have projected there. And we also, in terms of those leveraging, the leveraging of resources, what you try and do is respond to the needs in that particular landscape. And I will get into that once I've just said one more thing on this slide, is that, and Danny, you'll acknowledge me here, I'm going to acknowledge Global Water Partnership because it's GWP Technical Committee that came up with the concept of the 3 I's. And that the message, if we're trying to look at water security in a climate change threatening environment, we must absolutely, for water security, invest. So GWP used to talk about the 3 I's. We've expanded that to say the 6 I's, and we must look at inclusive, integrated investments in information, in institutions, and in infrastructure. And if you say the 6 I's, it just comes to you, it's a nice way to remember the important principles of where we need to invest. And if we're looking at investment, we try and promote this in the work that we do in the strategic water source areas, promote, support information, data gathering, research, look at institutional capacity development, and here the model of actually trying to place these ecological coordinators, ecological infrastructure coordinators or catchment coordinators in the landscape, indicated by the figures there. We have 12 scattered around South Africa in the different strategic water source areas. but they are from the landscape, they mobilize, they help leverage resources, they bring together the partners, they engage in processes to actually address the needs, the challenges in that particular landscape. And these ecological infrastructure coordinators are often placed with either a water user association, and there was even one with a catchment management agency. So, and another has just recently, or is recently going to be placed in provincial government environment affairs. So placing these ecological infrastructure coordinators to support the work of the mandated institutions, to work in these CPPP, in the CPPP modality is one way that's really working tremendously well. And when also just to emphasize it, when we're talking about the 3 I's or the 6 I's of investments in information institutions and infrastructure, yes, we're saying very much, let's invest in built infrastructure, let's invest in ecological infrastructure. May I have the next slide, please?
You're going over time, so if you could please finish up in about 30 seconds.
Quick. Okay. This is just to show you where we work in rangeland management, wetland restoration, and also alien invasive clearing in the high catchments in Eastern and Western Cape and Drakensberg as well. The approach we adopt is not only to tackle the ecological problem, but to tackle the socio-economic problem as well. So Lebogang mentioned the issue of jobs, and we really need to be looking at this from what are the needs on the ground and how do we bring in the securing of strategic water source areas by addressing the needs on the ground. So job creation through alien invasive clearing is very big in the wetland restoration. A beautiful picture there showing the wetland restoration and making it functional again. This actually, and as someone mentioned the youth earlier, this was actually an intern previously at WWF, and she later established her own nursery business, SMME, in the area. Last slide, please. Sorry to rush like this. I hope you read those stats about how much water is released when alien invasives are cleared. And then in a very different landscape, the previous set of slides was more in the Boland-Windhoek strategic water source area, more the Western Cape side of things. This is in a rural communal landscape in the Eastern Cape, where the approach to securing the Eastern Cape Drakensberg strategic water source area has really been, what are the challenges in terms of rangeland management? There's a lot of erosion. How do we find the incentives to encourage the people from that landscape to invest their time and energy and engage in different management processes? What are the incentives that we use? So bringing in, supporting them with their auctions, their cattle auctions, that is an incentive, introducing mechanisms to rotating the grazing lands, looking at different, there's water access problem, was also mentioned by Lebogang, and really just looking at protecting the natural springs. But
thank you so much, Ruth. I'm sorry I need to interrupt you because we're going over time significantly.
Approach. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We want to leave time to hear from Alex McNamara, who is coming to us from the National Business Initiative, and give you some opportunity to share your experiences from the NBI in terms of the practical solutions for municipalities and the private sector involvement as well. Over to you.
Sure. Thank you, Chair. I think I'll build on what's been said, but effectively drawing on, like you say, on practical work that all of us, I guess, in the sector are doing. I think I'll start with business. I mean, it's kind of been mentioned, but effectively the solutions that business are involved with, on the one hand, is kind of your informal collaboration, the stuff that I think many of the people on the call have been talking about. Business cannot solve the water sector challenge on its own, but they can be catalytic. They can't solve water governance challenges, on their own, but they can play a role. So everything that people are talking about is like, how do we embed coordinatory support, or how do we build capacity? All of those things are ways in which I think business can play a critical role, especially in informal collaboration. So there's a whole realm of water stewardship, which we've talked about now, which is this area of informal collaboration where business recognizes that they have to get their own house of water, but they also have to think beyond the fence line, and that they can play this kind of in a way, transformative role. And I think certainly if experience, of the water partnerships in our country show, including ones that we all collaborate on this call, the solutions do exist and they can be implemented. Whether it's helping to build small businesses, using business knowledge, building small businesses in catchment management, or whether it's how to actually improve data and monitoring so that actually there is transparency and understanding of how a water system works, that then everybody can benefit from, or helping to place sort of catchment people on the ground who then play this kind of intermediary role. I think all of those examples where many businesses in our country, particularly in forestry, retail, food and beverage, those kinds of banking, those kinds of sectors, have recognized that water is a strategic issue. It's a collective asset. We need to invest and we need to play a role. And sometimes all they do is just set up a kind of a vehicle or like a neutral platform, and that others then can build trust and build capacity, and then over time can lead to investment. So for me, I think the first paradigm is just this kind of water stewardship paradigm where businesses involved. We have a fairly solid track record of water stewardship in South Africa already. And then if you flip over to the other side, we haven't really talked about it. I mean, I think Constant, sort of raised it very briefly, is much more formal collaboration. So legal, long-term legal contracts in the form of public-private partnerships. We know that there are municipalities who do not have the revenues and the capacity to run their water infrastructure or their wastewater infrastructure. So it's essentially about knowing where are the municipalities that do require private sector expertise and finance, and there are quite a few of them. Our recent national infrastructure plan has basically said the draft plan has said we're not going to make it from a water investment perspective if we don't bring in private capital, significant private capital. And we also know there are municipalities who maybe have the ability to procure services, but don't have the capacity to properly run their infrastructure. So I think certainly from the work that we've done and what we see in the water space presently, there are private sector operators and people working in the sector already who could offer a lot of the kind of long-term, reliable infrastructure management that we need in the water sector. So in the sort of more formal legal, procurement of services, private sector has, I think, a critical role to play. And a lot of this is about performance contracts. So municipalities who deliver water services in our country can sign performance contracts with private parties where actually the delivery risk sits with the private sector. So we have two very, very successful three actually very successful water public-private partnerships in the country already. And I don't see how, especially municipalities that just no longer have the balance sheet to invest in what they need, I don't see how we will avoid formal collaboration by the business sector as well. And all of these things, as I say, are already happening. And then the other part of the question was municipalities or local government, the people who actually deliver water services. I think what's been useful there is the ways in which we focused on getting the basics right. So certainly the MBI has a whole program around technical assistance and mentorship of municipal officials. And all we try to do is build systems and procurement capacity. There's some technical engineering type skill transfer as well, but a lot of it is just retired mentors who help you build get the basics right. I mean, Constant made a very important point around the fact that municipal water businesses are not financially viable in our country, and we're not going to turn the tide unless that starts to come right. So things like adequate billing and credit control, and basically improve customer service, that actually the revenues start to flow, as it says in our water master plan, that those who can afford to pay for water do actually pay for water. Then we could start to get to a virtuous cycle, more money in the system, more credit-worthy municipalities, and a much better situation. So basics right, financial management, etc., I think is a key enabler. And I mean, our particular mentorship program has been running for a few years now. We've worked very closely with provincial governments and local governments, and I think it's a very clear example that there are skills that can be provided and transferred into local governments if they're well thought through, if you have good political buy-in, and if the intention is correct, if the intention is to really co-develop and support skills development for the long term in municipalities. And then just a couple, minor examples, but in terms of solutions, we've had quite good results with the use of things like drones and drone technology, so that We have a fairly cost-effective way to figure out how spatial sediment patterns are changing, where water leaks are occurring, and actually finding that this is a way to impart good skills transfer to municipalities. We recently engaged with one municipality where we actually trained them as drone pilots, and we have effectively, instead of rather using satellite imagery or aerial photographs, the drones have really provided quite useful information in their water leakage efforts as well. And then just data monitoring, data systems. One of the things we didn't really touch on in the context phase of this discussion was that many of our kind of data monitoring systems are not up to date. Sometimes equipment has just become faulty over time. And it makes it very difficult to know, well, how much water is in the dam, or how much water is rather in the river and in the weir, and how are we going to manage this whole complex water system? And so one of our big initiatives at the moment is just making sure that we upgrade our water dashboards, so we have good data coming in, and we can have complete visibility on that. So on one of our projects we're doing right now, we're talking about a water dashboard that will be open access to anybody who is interested in that catchment, based on a locally developed system which has been piloted in 2 other regions of our country. So using local technology that creates transparency around water data, water quality, water quantity, where it is, that becomes a management tool and accountability tool as well. So thank you, Chair. I think those are some examples of things that we've been active with, both on the sort of formal side with the public sector and the sort of informal side, and some of the municipal stuff as well.
Thank you so much for those examples. One thing that you said that I found very intriguing was there's a lot of pressure on business to deliver, but what you said, business can't do it alone, and I think none of us can do this alone. And so that brings me to my next question about the role of stakeholders. How can stakeholders help deliver water in a sustainable and equitable way? And I'll be looking to Le Bourrin for that.
Thank you. So it really ties in with that point that business can't do it alone, and to some extent, government also can't do it alone. So we need a broad range of stakeholders working together for a common purpose here, which I think is going to be important moving forward. Nikki makes incredible examples, especially around this Umgeni partnership. And I know there's no one test case as to how stakeholder participation can work well, but I think this whole idea of collaboration should be expanded across municipalities, because I think it's a great way in which various partners can come together and push a particular imperative goal of providing and secure water resources for communities. I think in an extension to this Umgeni partnership, what should really feature significantly in these partnerships is the role of the community members who are custodians of this water. I think I like the idea of, water champions in particular regions. I think the reason why there's so much degeneration of water resources, especially at a community level, is because community members don't feel like they're vitally important to the sustainable flow and the sustainable acquisition of water resources. So keeping the water clean. So if I don't feel like I am a significant stakeholder in these processes, why should I participate meaningfully in ensuring that, we keep water clean? We report when we see leakages. We report when we see anything wrong when it comes to water infrastructure. So I think this idea, especially of elevating communities, I think teaching communities is vital. Teaching communities so that they do know that there are partnerships that exist. There are institutional frameworks that exist that can welcome the participation of communities, I think is so vitally important. You cannot participate in processes that you don't know exist. So I think for communities, that's going to be so important moving forward so that they can be vital stakeholders. Another thing, I know, when we go to communities and you do your processes, especially when you're trying to get stakeholder engagement, especially when it comes to issue of water, it's often not in a meaningful way. So you're there to tick a box to say that you spoke to the community because it's some sort of KPA on some government's project or whatever the case may be. So I think meaningful engagement with the community is going to be important, and I think including them in these stakeholder processes is going to be of key importance, because at the end of the day, the community is the custodian of all of these efforts. The infrastructure is within the communities. So if if we're going to have, stakeholder participation, and I know the private sector is vitally important, government is vitally important, but this infrastructure resides within the communities, and it's the community that must be able to take care of it after everybody has done their job. So I think that's going to be of key importance. Another point that Ruth has made that I think is really important is this idea that, protect water conservation, infrastructural development, that has job creating potential. And the job creating potential must prioritize communities. Communities must be seen to be participating in all of those programs, because if that's not the case, again, how do they become effective custodians and effective stakeholders when it comes to issues of securing water and protecting water infrastructure? I think to a large extent, the points around the various stakeholders have been made, but I really like this idea that, various stakeholders coming together, putting their hands on deck is probably what's going to drive the initiative here. We're going to need the government, because clearly we're going to need a lot of policy certainty. We're going to need to know a lot of regulations and to have a number of regulations in place. And I think government is central for that role. So they create the enabling environment for everything. The private sector, we're going to need the private sector to invest. We're going to need them to participate. So definitely we're going to need the private sector in that regard. I like this issue of data and knowing where everything is. So we're going to need the academics to be on board. We're going to need the NGOs, but particularly let's not forget that the actual and meaningful participation of the community in these various processes, because at the end of the day, we're doing this to make sure that, these water resources are available for communities who need them the most. I think to a large extent, the various panel members have covered the points extensively.
Great, thank you so much for that. The main takeaway is everyone has a role to play. Everyone has a shared responsibility when it comes to water resources. And with that, we're going to now turn toward the third part of this event, where we're going to be listening to a case study of an approach from a development finance institution. For that, we're going to be hearing from Constance Brunette and Olympus Mantata, who are going to share with us their experience and what their institution has done to overcome all of the challenges that they've encountered. So I believe Constance is going to start and you will come in afterwards, correct? Over to you, Constance.
Thank you very much, Daniela. If I can, may I ask that the slides be flighted? I prepared a couple of slides. Great, okay. Just as a little bit of intro and background, government is responding to the call to action and the challenges identified in the National Water Master Plan, and is in the process of developing and designing a number of programs within the water sector that will address specific challenges facing the water sector. Priority sub-programs currently in development is, first of all, the National Non-Revenue Water Program, a National Water Reuse Program, and then a private sector participation model. As I've mentioned, the sub-programs are currently in development stage, and the intention is to position these sub-programs as blended finance programs. If we can just move to the next slide, please. Next slide. Thank you. So the intention of the National Water Program is, first of all, through the establishment of a Program Management Office, PMO, to provide centralized expertise to project owners, municipalities, to drive project preparation, facilitate funding, and monitor the implementation process. And secondly, to provide customized funding solutions to support the implementation of a specific asset class. So in a nutshell, the primary objective of the National Water Program is to prepare projects, facilitate and mobilize funding for the scaled implementation of projects across the country. If we can move to the next slide, please. Through the national PMO, government wants to create a center of excellence, providing assistance to project owners, municipalities on a number of key criteria required to successfully prepare and implement projects. Now, some of the criteria include, first of all, project preparation, and I have mentioned the issue of project preparation. Here we see the PMO playing a role assisting municipalities to scope and prepare, design their projects up to bankable level. Secondly, the issue of procurement, providing assistance to municipalities with limited capacity to procure, and giving them the option to, through a centralized procurement approach, appoint consultants or service providers, contractors, for their projects. Standardization is another key point to be addressed, and I also did touch on it earlier. Although we recognize that projects are unique in their own sense, there are a number of things that can be standardized on a project. For instance, if we look at non-revenue water projects, one can standardize terms of reference for a bankable feasibility study, for instance. And as the market becomes more familiar with the standardized documentation, it will reduce the transaction cost and also improve the speed to market. So the PMO playing a role to put standardized documentation in place. Also looking at best practice. For instance, when we look at best practice case studies successfully implemented across the globe, for instance, performance-based contracting for non-revenue water projects, we want to take that and tailor it for a South African context. Lebogang mentioned communication and how important communication at community level is. And here we also see the PMO playing a role engaging with communities and consumers to create awareness, water scarcity, and playing a role to manage public perceptions, for instance, when it comes to water reuse and direct or indirect potable reuse projects. Technology and innovation is another aspect that we feel the PMO will play a role. Evaluating and maybe vetting new technology that's coming to the market and pulling that into the different sub-programs. And I think we also discussed the importance of monitoring and reporting and doing contract management. And here we see also the PMO playing a role on projects being implemented and giving that independent reporting to, for instance, financiers. And then the last point I want to highlight is also the enabling environment. I did also touch on the importance of having that enabling environment. And again, here we see the PMO playing an influencing role, looking at policy and regulatory considerations and making recommendations to central government. Next slide, please. So just on briefly on funding solutions, when we look at blended financing, that is the process of combining public and repayable finance to make finance available to projects, and it's recognized as an important mechanism to leverage additional funding into the sector. All the sub-programs are developed taking blended financing principles into consideration, with a view to crowd in commercial private sector funding to capitalize investment at scale. And the different programs will have different funding options, structures, and solutions. So looking at a non-revenue water project, for instance, that will differ, when you look at it, for instance, a water reuse project. And looking at the role of the DBSA as a DFI in this process, we will play a key role to develop, for instance, innovative products and instruments to address market failure through providing first-class or subordinated facilities, longer tenor extensions, and to develop some guaranteed products for the municipal space. And all of this to crowd in private sector funding and to catalyze infrastructure investment and implementation of projects at scale. Maybe just to summarize from my side in terms of the progress to date, you know, as I've mentioned, the development of these 3 sub-programs are underway. And maybe just to make special mention, and I think my colleague Olympus will elaborate on that, to say that looking at the water reuse program, the DBSA was successful in obtaining GCF funding for the design of the water reuse program. And upon completion of the program, the DBSA will prepare a full funding proposal to the GCF. But I think, as I've mentioned, Olympus will elaborate a little bit more on that. And then just in closing, I would like to state that, you know, this is, again, a collaborative approach between all government, or a lot of government departments, DWS, SALGA, the DBSA. This is not a DBSA initiative, collaborating with government and key stakeholders to put this national water program in place. I think from my side, that is all. Thank you very much, Danielle.
Thank you very much. And so we're going over to Olympus now.
Okay, thank you very much. And I won't be long, so I'll save you a bit of time. I think my colleague Constant has really covered the subject quite well, but I really appreciate also the first 2 sessions of questions. I think they've laid a solid foundation where this particular topic is concerned. The only part I really wanted to add is that I think in line with the partnership and collaboration theme that we talked to is our work with the GCF, especially with their support around the design of the water reuse program as part of the national program that Constant talked to. And the idea that we took there was really to start at project preparation level, you know, with support from the GCF, to start thinking about how to design this water reuse program. And that obviously includes a lot of consultation with key stakeholders to really see what are the components that we need to be looking at and bring in you know, consultants in the space to ensure that we really build a solid program. So we are right now, you know, busy with that work. We are envisaging that we'll finish the program around December, and I know I'm talking about next month, so the pressure is on. But the idea is really to ensure that we, you know, all these important components are taken care of and we build a solid program. As Constant mentioned, move on to, you know, developing a solid, a full proposal back to the GCF to seek for full implementation funding, where obviously from the DBSA side we will, co-fund, hopefully on a matching basis, but really to provide a platform on a national basis where we can start supporting municipalities at different level, not only your metropolitan municipalities, but even your smaller municipalities towards implementation. That would talk to various instruments that we can look at that are appropriate for the different levels. But the idea is really to potentially come up with an asset class on the water reuse side that we believe could be quite important in shifting the needle on a national basis. So Constant talked about the project management office, pretty much looking at potentially looking at the model that we used on the independent power producer program from the energy side, learn as much as we can from that program to enhance what we are trying to do in this space. So we're really looking forward to that as an important contribution to our water challenges on a national basis. Thank you very much, Dan.
Thank you so much. So we are running out of time, but I do want to go back to Alex very quickly to see how business can get involved to assist DFIs such as DBSA to ensure sustainable climate resilient water infrastructure from your perspective. Alex?
Sure. I mean, I'll be brief. I mean, obviously, the first step is the companies need to get their own house in order. I mean, there was the important point made around, their water discharges, their wastewater discharges. They've got to do that kind of thing. They have to think about water efficiency and conservation. But when it comes to, I guess, what Constant was thinking about and what he was talking about, just to say we're very excited about the PMO and the work that we've done consulting with stakeholders widely on what we need to unlock investment. As much as we support targeted engagement and capacity building of specific municipalities, we know we need centralized support of munis. So very exciting. I think the kinds of areas that are being looked at are exactly the kinds of areas that we need. So obviously, the obvious example is that business is going to be an end financier. So we all know that the banks, the investors, I guess also impact investors are all waiting in the wings, effectively, to play that financing role. Whether it's from long-term pension funds or impact investors or just the commercial banks, we all know we have the financial system and architecture that is ready to deploy into projects as in which we have bankability. So this project preparation, standardization is all the kind of elements that will get us to that point. So I think that's quite an obvious example. The only other thing that I thought of that's kind of interesting is that the role that the companies play with their own employees. So some companies have got thousands of employees in their field. So to the extent that employees are thinking about water, are aware of it, and also are paying for water services and have good financial health when it comes to their utilities, it's also actually an investment in long-term repayment of water, right? So companies in their own house can not think just only about their water, but also the people that work for them, and of course their supply chain. If they're all managing water effectively, paying their bills if they can afford to, they start to themselves build that virtuous cycle, and the kinds of payments that in the end are going to pay off these municipal projects as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. With that, I'm going to just say a few words in conclusion. I have very much enjoyed this discussion, and I hope that through this discussion we've furthered our understanding of water security, but also what the value of water is. And we've clearly defined the opportunities and the approaches towards ensuring adaptation in the water sector and the roles that DFIs and partners can play. So it's really, really encouraging to see what can be achieved when we work together towards common goals through cooperation and collaboration for the benefit of a maximum number of communities, because they're the ones that are actually faced with the climate change impacts. So with that, I would like to thank you very much, all of our panelists, for your participation today. Thank you to our audience who's been watching here in the pavilion, but also online. And goodbye for now, and stay safe. Thank you so much.